A researcher cracks a writing system in a museum in Cardiff, Wales in 2011. Not a known writing system, a completely unknown one. And the twist? It's based on maps. Not symbols, not sounds, not pictograms in the way we think of them, maps. Cartography as language. And according to this researcher, it was in use on every continent except Antarctica before 1500 BC, with origins stretching back to 77,000 BC. Welcome to Copilot Podcasts. Today, we're unpacking the discovery of iconographic writing and the great migration it helped document, specifically, what this writing system actually is, how it was deciphered, and what it tells us about the movement of ancient peoples across the entire planet. By the end of this episode, you'll have a completely different picture of how old human civilization actually is. I've got someone here who has gone deep into this research, and I want to start with the most basic question. What exactly is iconographic writing?
So the researcher behind this, who publishes under the name An Unknown Soldier, describes iconographic writing as a visual markup language. And the key word there is visual. It doesn't modulate verbal information the way alphabets do. It modulates visual information. And the wisdom of that, as the researcher puts it, is immediately clear when you think about language barriers. If you have a writing system that's based on images derived from geography, from the actual shape of the land, then it doesn't matter what language you speak. The map is the message.
Okay, so it's not like hieroglyphics where you have a bird that means a sound.
Right, and that distinction is actually central to the whole discovery. Hieroglyphics, the researcher argues, were an innovation on top of this older system. Egypt essentially upgraded, the researcher's phrase is, Egypt upgraded to Twitter while her neighbours remained with conventional mail. Every Egyptian god in this framework is a bust depicting regional geology of Africa in what the researcher calls anamorphic similes. So, if your kingdom looked like a pintail duck, the head of your king was depicted as a man with a pintail duck's head. That's it. That's the origin of the Egyptian pantheon.
That is a wild reframe. So the animal heads on Egyptian gods aren't religious symbolism in the way we've always assumed. They're literally geographic identifiers.
That's the argument. And the researcher traces the morphological interface between iconographic writing and pictographic writing directly through Egyptian hieroglyphics. But the system itself is far older than Egypt. The researcher dates the iconographic record to 77,000 BC, following the Toba Super Eruption in Indonesia. That's the starting point.
So how did this get discovered? Like, what actually happened in Cardiff in 2011?
So the researcher was in the National Museum of Wales and accidentally deciphered something called the Bryn Cellthythu pattern stone, a megalith discovered buried beneath a mound on the Isle of Anglesey in 1929. In an archaeological context, radiocarbon dated to 3,500 BC. The analysis on that stone alone exceeds 200 pages. But the researcher found a more compelling example while wintering on the Costa del Sol in Spain, the Dama de Elche.
The Dama de Elche, I know that piece. It's that famous carved bust, right? There's been debate for decades about what it actually is.
Exactly. It was once believed to be an imported fetish used by a Carthaginian tribal chief as a funerary urn. But in profile, the Dama de Elche placed next to a satellite image of Spain and Portugal in isolation is, the researcher's word, nearly irrefutable. The carving is a composition based on cartography. The profile of the Iberian Peninsula is the profile of the Dama de Elche.
Okay, I want to sit with that for a second because that's a huge claim. You're saying a famous ancient sculpture is actually a map of Spain.
A map of the realm it documented, yes. And the compositional rules the researcher lays out make this testable. Rule 1, the constitution had to look just like the realm it documented, borders and general details based on cartography. Rule 2, the king had to look like the kingdom. That's why all the fantastic headdresses exist. Rule 3, every station of the nobility had to be represented by icons within the boundary of the realm, almost always in geophysical relationship to each other. So these compositions aren't just maps, they're a representative census of the principal leadership nodes and institutions of a realm. The researcher calls them constitutions.
Constitutions. So we're not talking about art or religion in the way we've categorized these things. We're talking about governance documents.
That's the reframe, yeah. And the researcher is very direct about what this means for how we categorize ancient societies. The indigenous tribes of the British Isles in 3,500 BC weren't tribes, they were kingdoms.
Each kingdom documented its structure and the function of its nobility in iconography, rendering these compositions, for all intents and purposes, constitutions.
So how do you actually make one of these? Like, how did ancient people create accurate maps without satellites or modern surveying equipment? This is where it gets genuinely fascinating. The researcher describes a technique called soloromancy, and the technical process is, quote, a snap. You place a staff upright in the ground beneath the sun. You place a stone on the tip of the staff's shadow. Later in the afternoon, the shadow has moved. You place a stone on the tip of the new shadow. Draw a line between the two stones and you have a perfect east to west line every time. The researcher says this technique remains more accurate than modern GPS satellites.
Wait, more accurate than GPS? That's a bold claim.
It's the researcher's claim, and the logic is that because the sun is the frame of reference, there's no signal degradation, no atmospheric interference. You're working directly from the source. And critically, the researcher notes this is the same method the United States Army teaches in basic training. That's actually how the researcher came to recognize it, military training.
So the researcher is a veteran.
Publishing as an unknown soldier, specifically to credit the US Armed Forces with the training that made the discovery possible. And the example the researcher uses to demonstrate soloromancy is Moses on Mount Sinai. The argument is that Moses spent 40 years in the kingdom of Midian as a shepherd apprentice to Jethro, who was an Ishmaelite priest. During those 40 years, Moses was surveying the Sinai Peninsula using this technique, climbing to the highest peak, which the researcher identifies as Mount Catherine, recording azimuths to prominent landmarks, and building up a map over decades.
And the burning bush fits into this somehow.
The researcher argues the burning bush is the iconographic record of Moses' completed survey of the kingdom of Midian. The wadis, the dry riverbeds of the Sinai, form the shape of a bush when mapped. And because the sun was the instrument of God in this worldview, the process of cartography wasn't regarded as science, it was regarded as divination. Soloromancers were the priestly caste who interpreted solar phenomena. So when Moses says he saw a bush burning with fire that was not consumed, the researcher reads that as Moses describing, in the phonetic language that replaced iconographic writing, ding, what he had just mapped.
That is a completely different way of reading one of the most famous moments in religious history.
And the researcher is careful to say, this doesn't make the canon wrong, it makes the popular interpretation of the canon incomplete. That's a distinction the researcher returns to repeatedly. The same logic applies to Noah's flood. The researcher doesn't dispute Genesis, disputes the popular interpretation of Genesis.
Okay, let's get into the Great Migration itself, because that's where all of this iconographic writing actually gets applied. What is the Great Migration in this framework?
So the researcher is very explicit that the Great Migration was not a single event. It was a meta-process in history, the researcher's exact phrase, which in the Archaic was mediated by protocols of the nobility that prohibited land grabs. That's the key structural element. There were rules, there was arbitration, there were what the researcher calls divine councils, essentially supreme courts, that had to bless any new claim of dominion before it was recognized.
So ancient geopolitics had referees.
Structured referees with protocols. And the researcher traces this through specific figures from Hindu scripture, Shinto scripture, Maori oral tradition, and Genesis, arguing these are all iconographic histories of the same process. The founding court of what the researcher calls Garuda the Greater was located in the headwaters of the Chao Phraya River. Over time, as the need for arbitration on the frontier of development increased, the realm court was relocated to the headwaters of the Mekong River.
And Garuda, that's the eagle figure on the royal arms of Thailand today.
Exactly. The researcher identifies two forms, Garuda the Greater and Garuda Strident, which is the form on Thailand's royal arms today. Both are described as compositions in the iconographic writing system, based in part on cartography. And the shift from one form to the other corresponds to the relocation of the realm court. Garuda essentially shrank himself down to become Garuda Strident when the court moved to what the researcher calls Mount Meru.
So the iconographic form of a deity changes when the political geography changes. The symbol updates to reflect the new territorial reality.
That's the logic, yes. And the researcher extends this to explain why Asia's 7 river kingdoms all converged in their headwaters and nearly fell into conflict. All 7 major rivers of Asia converge in the headwaters, so all 7 river kingdoms discovered their aspirations led to an impasse. The resolution came through a figure recalled in Hindu scriptures as Parashurama, who secured the Brahmaputra catchment from a land grab and arbitrated a solution: limit Asia's realm to the existing 7 kingdoms and cooperatively reclaim the Indian subcontinent.
So instead of going to war over the bottleneck, they agreed to expand together in a different direction.
Cooperatively reclaim the Indian subcontinent to avoid conflict. And a young prince named Garuda, distinct from the iconographic Garuda, was chosen to explore, survey, and eventually claim the subcontinent west of the Ganga for future generations. Meanwhile, Parashurama's protege, Prince Rama, eventually pulled off what the researcher calls a feat of true statesmanship, convincing the divine councils of the 7 rivers realm that each should play an equal part in reclaiming the Indian subcontinent.
And Ganesha fits into this too, right? Because the shape of India's coast is part of this.
The researcher argues that a simple appreciation of the contours of India's coast and inland rivers reveals the kingdom of the elephant, Ganesha. And Ganesha's role was to document and claim the subcontinent of India for posterity. He and his men established seasonal camps at each river delta along the coast, planted lotus in the wetlands all along the way. That logistical foundation is what allowed Noah and his family to bypass what the researcher calls the dead coast of India and return to reclaim Arabia.
Noah. Okay, so Noah appears in this framework not as a figure from a global flood story, but as a historical prince reclaiming Arabia.
The researcher believes every word of the Genesis narrative, but interprets it iconographically. The ark was built in Indonesia, a place referred to as the Islands of the Gentiles in Genesis. The flood stage only rose to 30 feet, as Genesis actually states, and the mountains that were subsumed weren't the mountains of the whole world, they were the mountains of Sumatra, which sank, not the seas which rose. The researcher argues the narrative was an eyewitness report constrained by the perceptual limits of the survivors. For all they knew, all the mountains in the world had been subsumed.
That's actually a really coherent reading of the text if you take it literally rather than globally.
And the researcher traces Noah's journey in extraordinary geographic detail. In 75,000 BC, sea levels were 40 meters lower than today. The Arabian Gulf didn't exist as we know it. There was a massive river system the researcher calls the Mesopotamian River, now on the seabed of the Arabian Gulf, described as the largest and most lush river system in the hemisphere at that time. Noah, his 3 sons, and their wives travelled up the Euphrates and Tigris to their headwaters, landing on the slopes of the highest mountain in that catchment, Mount Ararat.
And then the 3 sons go in 3 directions from Ararat.
Each discovers a lake. The eldest goes north and finds Lake Sevan in modern Armenia, a freshwater lake which the researcher identifies as the most immediately useful for fresh water. The second finds Lake Urmia in modern Iran, a salt flat too briny to drink. The third finds Lake Van to the west, also briny and the smallest of the 3. And here's where the iconography becomes extraordinary. The researcher identifies the Lake Urmia catchment as the iconographic dove of Genesis. The shape of the river system, when mapped, looks like a dove.
So the dove that Noah releases from the ark, that's not a literal bird. It's a map of a river catchment.
The researcher's argument is that the raven, the olive tree, the olive branch, each are iconographic. The westernmost feeder river in the Urmia catchment, identified in what the researcher calls arboreal green, is the iconographic olive branch held in the beak of the iconographic dove. The Armenian Valley system defining the Caucasus region, just north of Ararat where Noah's eldest son established his first court on the shores of Lake Sevan, forms the iconographic olive tree. The researcher says, take this shape in isolation to any region where olive trees grow and ask any child what kind of tree it is. The immediate answer will be an olive tree.
Okay, I have to ask the skeptics question here. How do we know the researcher isn't just seeing shapes in maps the way people see faces in clouds? Like, at what point does pattern recognition become projection?
The researcher addresses this directly and actually invites that challenge. The methodology is tautological observation first. You classify and count what you see without imposing interpretation. Then you hypothesize. The researcher is also explicit that these are working hypotheses pending fieldwork, not confirmed theories, and the researcher distinguishes between what can be confirmed through multiple independent lines of evidence, the iconography, the oral tradition, the geology, the archaeology, versus what requires further investigation. The petroglyphs of Ulsan, Korea are a good example of where this methodology gets tested.
Tell me about those petroglyphs.
So the researcher identifies a petroglyphic atlas carved into a cliffside on the Korean coast, upstream from modern Ulsan, near Busan. The atlas features marine creatures, flighted creatures, land-dwelling creatures, stick figures, and one human-like face, along with what the researcher calls a rainbow glyph, a U-shaped iconograph in the upper corner. And it was that rainbow glyph that alerted the researcher to the fact this composition was based on a formal writing system, because the same glyph had already been confirmed in Indonesian iconography as an apex element.
So the same glyph appearing in both Indonesia and Korea suggests a shared writing convention.
A shared convention, the researcher argues, was employed across the widest possible region. And the census of creatures on the Ulsan Atlas, fish, orcas, seals, 2 bird species, deer, horse or cattle figures, stick figures, the researcher argues each maps to a specific geographic feature or kindred dominion in the region around Busan. The orca, for instance, when the coastline of Korea is colorized according to what the researcher calls the chromatic protocols of the nobility, emerges as a breaching orca from the geology. The eye patch appears precisely where it would on the creature.
And this connects to Izanagi and Izanami, the founding couple of Japan in Shinto tradition.
The researcher places Izanagi and Izanami in 75,000 BC, arriving in the region after Izanagi surveyed the northernmost islands along Asia's east coast and reported back to what the researcher calls the Divine Council of Oceania. The Shinto Kojiki records a scene where Izanagi drew the contours of his newly discovered islands in wet sand and built a model for the Divine Council to consider and bless. The researcher argues this scene is reiterated in every meditation garden maintained by Asian gardeners to this very day.
The Japanese rock garden as an echo of a 75,000-year-old cartographic presentation to a governing council. That's a lot to sit with.
And the researcher traces the regalia of the Japanese imperial family directly to this origin. The chrysanthemum, Japan's imperial symbol, the researcher identifies as the iconographic form of the Sea of Japan region when sea levels were 40 meters lower. Not the fully matured chrysanthemum we know today, but a bud. The shape of the coastline, in the chromatic protocols of the age, sovereign yellow, green for youth and growth, matches the shape of a chrysanthemum bud. The researcher says, deny it is not a perfect match where one was required to choose a floral simile.
And the koi, the carp, that's the aquatic familiar of the same realm.
Once the Sea of Okhotsk is included in the composition, the region resembles a koi, and the researcher connects this to the Chinese legend of the koi swimming up the Yellow River for 1,000 years, blocked by the Dragon Waterfall, until finally in a great leap it crested the falls and formed the nation of China. The researcher argues this is not imperial propaganda, as Mao insisted, but iconographic fact. The koi of legend is a map of the region documenting China's origins.
Okay, I want to come back to something you mentioned earlier, the idea that the Great Migration was governed by protocols that prohibited land grabs, because that's a really striking claim about ancient political organization. What does that actually look like in practice?
The researcher describes it through the episode of Gajendra, the iconographic elephant of India, overreaching his geological boundaries into territory already claimed by Noah's descendants in Arabia. The researcher frames this as a diplomatic struggle, not a physical battle. When the iconographic crocodile of the Mesopotamian river catchment cut off Gajendra's head, the Divine Council of the age recognized and blessed Arabia's claim to the greater Mesopotamian river system. In other words, Arabia was born as a sovereign realm through arbitration, not conquest.
So the mythology of Gajendra being seized by a crocodile is actually a record of a territorial dispute being resolved by an international governing body.
That's the researcher's reading. And the researcher is careful to say, we are not talking about a physical battle resulting in disfigurement of a combatant. We are talking about a diplomatic struggle resulting in a limit on India's claim of dominion. The iconographic language is vivid and dramatic, but the underlying event is political.
And then there's Maui, the Polynesian figure, who fits into this as the leader of the Austronesian branch of the migration.
The researcher places Maui in the same generation as Noah and Izanagi, departing from Bukit Kilim in Borneo, which the researcher identifies as the original Bridge of Heaven, to reclaim Austronesia. And the researcher argues Maui was not a god or a demigod, but a living human being, a prince who received the blessing of the Divine Council to lead the colonization of everything south of the equator. The researcher's definition of Austronesia includes Polynesia all the way to Hawaii and the Australian continent.
And the Maori wakas, the ceremonial canoes, are documents in this iconographic system.
The researcher submitted a proprietary brief to the Prime Minister of Australia in 2013, alerting the Australian government to the fact that Maori wakas, like most Maori art, are compositions in an archaic writing system based in part on cartography. The researcher's phrase is striking. Wakas are not just any old longboat carved with eye candy. Wakas are documents which record and preserve kindred bona fides and the covenant which binds a people together in common destiny. In a single word, wakas are constitutions of a commonwealth.
So the Maori Waka Maratua, which Maori elders identify as the Waka of Maori origins, is essentially a founding document.
Genesis and Exodus for the Maori people, the researcher calls it, scripture. And the figure seated on the prow, Taroa, the captain, defers to a pair of royal albatrosses that identify the sovereign authority. The researcher argues Maui features prominently on several wakas but not his own, because Maui was an exemplar, a saint in the researcher's framing, not a sovereign.
There's something almost poignant about that. The person who did the most work doesn't get the top billing on the document.
And the researcher connects Maui's iconographic narrative to the Sulawesi archipelago. Taranga, Maui's mother, is identified with that region, and the ocean god Tangaroa, who saves the infant Maui, is identified as a jellyfish in the iconography of the same region. The researcher says, I am now 100% certain that lock of hair Taranga wrapped Maui in before casting him into the sea was in fact the Buru archipelago. What looks like mythology is a record of the investiture of a young prince in the oceanic peerage of nobility.
I want to go back to something that's been sitting in the back of my mind this whole conversation. The researcher mentions that academia has largely refused to engage with this work. 12 years of inviting feedback and being refused, primarily for fear of losing tenure. What's the researcher's take on why that is?
The researcher is pretty direct about it and pretty frustrated. The argument is that since World War II, academia has imposed what the researcher calls fascistic rules governing the scientific process. Specifically, academics are forbidden from hypothesizing anything civilized in the archaeological record before certain accepted dates. The researcher's phrase is, hypothesizing the domestication of animals or horticulture prior to the Younger Dryas is tantamount to goose-stepping across the quad. And the researcher argues this reflex, meant to prevent fascist misuse of archaeology, has itself become a form of intellectual suppression.
That's a genuinely uncomfortable tension. The tools meant to prevent one kind of distortion, creating another kind.
And the researcher acknowledges the stakes. The researcher openly invites the audience to offer hypotheses of their own, and explicitly says, I don't own the scientific method, I just insist you stick to it. The frustration isn't with rigor, it's with the refusal to even engage with the hypothesis at the tautological observation stage before interpretation even begins.
There's also a tangent in the research that I find genuinely fascinating, the orca hide coracles. Can you explain that?
So the researcher observes that orcas are known to beach themselves, entire pods following their matriarch to their doom when she decides to beach herself. And orca hides, when fully stretched, form a single contiguous hide with only one hole to sew shut. Perfect material for a coracle, a boat made of hides stretched over a wood frame. But the practical reason for choosing orca hide specifically is remarkable. Sharks flee from orca scent. Any other hide would attract hungry sharks along a shark-infested coast. An orca hide would send them fleeing in terror.
So the choice of material is a survival technology hidden inside what looks like cultural tradition.
And the researcher connects this to why orcas were regarded with such reverence by Native American coastal tribes of the Pacific Northwest. The researcher notes these tribes held orcas in high regard, considering them powerful and intelligent beings, often referred to as wolves of the sea. The fluking behavior of orcas was observed with great respect and reverence, seen as a form of communication not just within orca pods, but with humans and the spiritual world. Many tribes believed orcas possessed the spirits of their ancestors. The researcher argues the petroglyphs of Ulsan, Korea, reveal precisely why and where orcas came to be regarded as avatars of ancestors.
Because the orca was the iconographic familiar of the founding dominion of that coast, Izanagi's realm.
And the researcher traces the tradition from Korea and Japan all the way to British Columbia. The first map of British Columbia, the researcher asserts, is an orca. The researcher even poses a challenge to the audience. Can you find the great orca and lesser orca of the Haida before I publish? The pattern of a greater and lesser form, Garuda the Greater and Garuda Strident, the great orca and the lesser orca, the great hornbill and the lesser hornbill, repeats across every realm the researcher has documented.
That's a structural pattern, a grammar almost. Every realm has a greater and lesser form of its iconographic familiar.
The researcher describes it as iconographic parity maintained on both sides of the equator. Austronesians and Asians were employing different color palettes and different materials, but the same iconographic protocols. And the researcher's overarching conclusion is that once accepted, this establishes there can be no denying the familial relationship between Austronesians and Asians. They weren't rivals, they were peers of the same realm.
And the Arabian Nights fit into this too, which I did not see coming.
The researcher argues the Arabian Nights are likely to prove very fertile ground for iconographic analysis. The specific example is Aladdin's lamp. The researcher identifies the iconographic lamp of faith as the Indonesian archipelago in iconographic form. The flame of that lamp is the tip of the Malaysian peninsula, and in origins, the Toba caldera. The smoke rising from that flame drifts across the Himalayan mountains to what the researcher calls the face of the map, a face visible in the topology of the eastern Caspian region. In other words, the Arabian legend of Aladdin's lamp is, in the researcher's words, no myth at all, but an ancient iconographic narrative of the origins of faith in this world.
So when you step back from everything we've covered today, the iconographic writing system, the Solaromancy, the Great Migration as a governed meta-process, the petroglyphs of Korea, the Maori wakas, the Orca coracles, Aladdin's lamp, what's the through line? What does this all actually add up to?
Here's what this really comes down to. The researcher is arguing that human civilization is dramatically older, more sophisticated, and more globally connected than our current frameworks allow. Not in a fringe way, in a methodologically grounded way that starts with tautological observation and builds through multiple independent lines of evidence. The iconographic writing system was a visual language that transcended spoken language barriers, which means the world's most ancient communication system was deliberately designed to be universally readable. That's not primitive, that's elegant.
And the Great Migration wasn't chaos, it was managed.
Managed by protocols, arbitrated by divine councils, documented in iconographic constitutions that survive today as mythology, as religious art, as royal regalia, as prayer postures, as garden design, as the shape of ceremonial canoes. The researcher's point is that these aren't separate cultural traditions that happen to resemble each other. They're branches of the same tree, and the roots go back to Indonesia in 77,000 BC.
And the fact that we can't see that is partly because of Alexander the Great burning Persia's archives, and Julius Caesar's torches burning the Library of Alexandria, and a century of academic rules that made it professionally dangerous to hypothesize civilization before certain dates.
The researcher puts it this way. In that fatal conflagration, the burning of Alexandria, all memory of Persia's true origins was obliterated. But not all records were burned. Arabia's nobility maintained accurate, albeit iconographic records of Arabia's origins. And the iconographic record is grounded in the bedrock of the earth. You can't burn a mountain. You can't erase a river catchment. The maps are still there.
The maps are still there. That's the thing that lingers, isn't it? We started this episode with a researcher cracking a writing system in a museum in Cardiff, accidentally, and what that discovery points toward is a version of human history where the movement of peoples across the entire planet was not random, not chaotic, not driven purely by survival instinct, but governed, documented, and remembered in a language written into the shape of the land itself.